guess we'll keep the Robertsons in our prayers, just with all that's gone on there.
And also Karen Cole. So, Shirley reminded me, if you can add there Annalise Williamson.
Hey, how are you?
So this is Thomas's girlfriend who is not out of the woods yet with her vision. Things are looking pretty good right now, but still may not be able to continue with school for a while.
Mm. All right. Well, we will start with that and say, who is anybody able to? Nathan, would you mind leading a prayer for us? Sorry to put you on the spot.
You're not.
You guys bow with me. Dear Lord, we're so grateful for this day and for every day that you give us and this time that we have to come together and worship you and learn more about your word and just be together in fellowship. We ask you, please be with those that we've mentioned today on the board and with our experience yesterday in Mooresville and just give them what you know they need, not what we think they need. That should be us now as we enter this time and give us our sins in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. You did well with that, Nathan. All right, so we are studying the Sermon on the Mount. For those of you who weren't here last week, we just started last week and went through a lot of the history behind both the location and the timing of the when and the where this took place. We kind of talked about some of the kind of evidence in Scripture, if you will, of kind of this was probably on the kind of northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee, near the city of Capernaum, on the mountains overlooking the sea there somewhere. And we talked about kind of a brief history of kind of what had gone on in this part of the world from basically around the time of Abraham up to this point, because it's kind of important as to kind of as we start to read about Jesus and his ministry during this time. It adds a unique perspective to have kind of that understanding of kind of, what was the culture in the country like, and kind of what were the things that people were dealing with, and these that often kind of overspills into kind of interactions and kind of why things may be said or done certain ways. And so we kind of left with this area of Galilee, Samaria, and Judea. And so around 27 or 28 AD, Galilee is a Roman client state. It's separate from the Roman province of Judea. The Galilee, which is not here, but it's on the north of here, okay, the purple area there up around the sea. Okay, Galilee is ruled by Herod Antipas, and as a Roman client state, not part of the Roman Empire. They're separate. Antipas paid tribute to the Roman Empire in exchange for Roman protection. Romans did not station troops in Galilee, but they threatened to retaliate against anyone who attacked this territory. And so as long as he paid the tribute, Antipas was permitted to govern however he wished, and he had his own coins, and he was relatively observant of Jewish laws and customs. Whereas the Roman province to the south, which included Judea, Samaria, and Edom, this was a Roman province. It was part of the empire. It was incorporated. And it is under Roman governance and rule. And from the point in time around 6 AD to around 44 AD, so kind of during the bulk of kind of Jesus' life, there's no Herod ruling this area. And it's kind of under the governance of the Romans completely. And We had briefly mentioned at the end of last week that, remember when we kind of talk about we read about the crucifixion, Jesus came before Pilate. Pilate sent him to Herod. The Herod that he sent him to was the Herod Antipas, because Jesus is from Galilee. And so even though there was no Herod over Judea and Jerusalem at the time of the crucifixion, that's kind of why that took place. Herod sent him back to Pilate and said, I don't want to have anything to do with this, right? But that's kind of what was happening there when we read about it. And so immediately prior to, so that's the timing, the location, and kind of where we got to. And so immediately prior to the events of the Sermon on the Mount, if you turn over to Mark chapter 3 and Luke chapter 6, we read that this is probably right before Jesus sits down with the crowds. It's probably the time that he selects the 12 apostles. And so we read over in Mark chapter 3, verses 7 through 19, where he goes up onto the mountain and he calls the 12 to him, and they're listed off by name. And also in Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 16 is kind of the corollary of that in the Gospel of Luke. After these events, we're told that he kind of, if you read there, he kind of comes down the mountain, and the crowds then gather to him. And in Luke chapter 6, it goes into kind of the Cliff Note version of the Sermon on the Mount at that time. And then Mark doesn't really talk much at all about the sermon, but it kind of does talk about him, withdrawing to the lake or the Sea of Galilee, having the boat ready, kind of going up on the mountain and having the followers that were following him around. And it's a lot of the same language and group people and kind of events and so it's thought to be probably a similar kind of point in time with the Matthew 5 sermon and the Luke 6. Okay, so that kind of has happened, we think, and then in Matthew 5, where kind of the sermon is in its entirety, or as much as we're given at least, is recorded. If we start reading there. Now when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. All right? So that's how the sermon starts. And you can see that if you read over in Luke chapter 6. And we're going to kind of go through bit by bit over the coming weeks, but I think at the end of this, or hopefully on your own, we talked about reading through this on your own last week, but I think as much as we can kind of analyze and break down and kind of talk about, and we're going to do that, it's still, I think, the way Jesus said it, right, is kind of probably the best way, and just kind of reading the words for what they are in its entirety, and maybe we can do that kind of on the last Sunday when we're concluding and just kind of read through the whole sermon after we've kind of gone through bit by bit and kind of, gotten some more detail into each section. But I don't want to kind of take away from, this is the sermon that came out of Jesus' mouth, right? And so the way he said it and trying to kind of, overanalyze that too much, sometimes we can maybe get into trouble, and that's not necessarily what we're trying to do. But I think it also, there's some good meat when we kind of look into kind of in depth in parts of Scripture, right? And that's kind of right what studying and praying and kind of reflecting on the words of Jesus. And that's what we're going to do over the sermon in the coming weeks. But not to take away from just sometimes it's just better to and good just to read the words and kind of they are what they are, right? So this is how he starts the sermon. And what do we notice about these beatitudes or these blessings that are given right at the start? Well, one thing I'll point out is that these are not commands. They're not commands. They're not intended to be commands, to be poor, to be meek. They are blessings. Okay? Now, doesn't mean it's bad to be meek or to be poor, but the intent here is not that these are commands from Jesus. They're blessings. And the intention is this, with these blessings, for you to know that when you are in deep mourning, God hears your heart and he blesses you. He wants you to know that if you're one of the losers, and most people in life are, that you're blessed. He wants you to know that if you're one of those people who doesn't have to dominate a room, you can just sit quietly. God doesn't just see the noisy ones. He blesses you. And the reason Jesus starts the sermon this way, I think, is because he is getting ready to give some really hard commands in the coming verses. And the only people who can obey these commands are people who are under the blessing of God. And that's why he starts out saying, blessed. Well, what does blessed or blessed even mean? Like, what does that word mean? We're going to kind of dig into this for a little bit. Thoughts? Happy? To be happy, okay.
Looked after.
To be looked after or have someone look over or after you, okay. So I looked it up because I was preparing this. So if you kind of look up in the dictionary, and to be blessed means to receive favor from, to be approved by, to be cared for or looked after. It's to receive protection or prosperity or endowment or happiness from. Okay, and that's kind of how our society or the people who write dictionaries would kind of describe that term. Okay, so when we say blessed are, that's what that means. Okay. And so in our society, we might say as Americans, right, we're a pretty blessed country, right? We have a lot of comforts and prosperities and conveniences and transportation and running water and air conditioning and all these things that still much of the world may not. And we enjoy relative peace and security for the most part compared to other parts of the world. And we have all these physical blessings, and most people in our nation enjoy these blessings and benefits, the good people and the bad people. And what does the Bible say about that? Blessing the good and the bad. All right, so Matthew chapter 5, verse 45, which we'll read later in the sermon. But, we're told that physical blessings of this world can happen to anyone, the just and the unjust. God permits this. There are a lot of people in our world that don't honor God, and nevertheless, they receive physical blessings in their lifetimes. Nice homes, health, employment, children. In our society, we often count our blessings based on what? What is, as kind of secular society in the United States, in this culture, this time, this day and age, what would we say is be kind of a blessing? Okay, material things, so stuff. I got a lot of stuff. I got cars, I got TVs, I got popularity, stature,
Health.
pleasures, health, right? Okay. And So Jesus is kind of saying the opposite of that in Matthew 5 when he gives his blessings, right? He's not saying that, blessed are the popular. Blessed are those high in stature. Blessed are those who have a lot of stuff, right? He's not saying that. He's saying the opposite of that. And it's a paradox. Who knows what a paradox is?
Two doctors.
So paradox is a statement that is seemingly contradictory or opposite to common sense, but yet it's probably true. Okay? The Bible is full of paradoxes. Why would the Bible be full of these paradoxes or these statements or virtues or kind of tidbits, if you will, that are kind of these contradictions to what, as humans, maybe even educated humans, we would think would be, this is common sense. But the Bible's saying the opposite of that, and the Bible's actually probably right.
Because God's ways are not our ways.
Exactly. The ways of God are different than the ways of men. John 4, Proverbs 5, Matthew 7. Okay? And that's kind of that's one of the neat things about Scripture, right? We kind of, the teachings are very different to what maybe we would hear from society, and yet they're true. And when we follow them, we shouldn't be surprised, but oftentimes we're surprised that, right? God tests us, right, to try to outgive Him, right? And that's the only way in which we're tested by God, right? Or God asks us to kind of test Him in this, right? In giving, and He said, just see if you can outgive me, and overflowing our cups and all this kind of stuff, and we would think is like if we're giving all our money and all our positions or all our time or all our this or all our that away, that you're going to be out of gas pretty quick in society. But God says the opposite is true, and how many kind of situations have we all experienced in our own lives where I'm not sure. I'm not sure we can make it through the rest of the month, but I feel really, my heart feels compelled to give here or do this or spend time here, even though that I'm needed elsewhere for work or something here. But I'm going to go and kind of prioritize this, and we do it, and then everything's still all right. It works out, and sometimes we even get more back than we had planned. Right? We all have stories and situations like that. So the paradox of the Bible, the world's view versus God's view. Much of our Bible study, from childhood up through now, as adults, in kind of our growth through the church, tends to highlight or focus on Bible characters and their traits, how individuals respond to God in a certain situation. And these traits are selected out as kind of exemplary or life lessons or the do's or the don'ts, right? Because they remind us or they model for us how to live as God instructs us and not as the world instructs us. All the while, remember, these characters in the Bible were also subject to the influences of the world just as we were, right? And so in Matthew 5, as we kind of look through the Beatitudes, the first part of Matthew 5, we're going to remember that these are not commands. And we're going to look at these blessings and kind of pick them apart one by one for a minute. Okay? So Christ says you'll be blessed if you fall into this category. If you find yourself poor in spirit, if you find yourself in mourning, you will be blessed. Whereas the world would tell us you are going to be blessed or advantaged if you're the opposite of that, right? Okay, and so I want to just kind of look at these paradoxes, okay, and just kind of God's teaching versus the world's teaching for a minute, because it's interesting to kind of think about it this way, I think. So the first one, poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit. What would be the opposite of poor in spirit?
Full of spirit. Full of spirit.
Okay, what is somebody who's full of spirit and spirited? They're puffed up. They're ego. Okay, pride, proud. Okay, personal independence. I can do it myself. All right, and so blessed are the poor in spirit, and because they will. But if you're poor in spirit, you'll be blessed with greatness, the greatest treasure or reward. Those who are poor in spirit. Whereas the world say, if you want to have greatness, if you want to have the greatest treasure, the greatest reward, you need to kind of, go after it and try to accomplish and try to be on the top, right? So here we're seeing the opposite of that. And so that great reward, greatest treasure, greatness is the kingdom of heaven, is what Christ says here. So let's look at the kingdom of heaven. Where in the Bible do we read about what the kingdom of heaven is? And there's several places, but I'll kind of narrow it down for us. There's some talk of the kingdom of heaven in Matthew. Parables, right? There's several parables where Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 13. Let's turn there for a minute. So we're trying to look here. So the blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So what does that mean? You're going to go to heaven? Does that mean what is that? What is that? What is it? You're going to rule the kingdom? Does it? What is he saying here? What is Jesus referring to when he says the kingdom of heaven? Well, what is the kingdom of heaven? Well, as Jesus personally describes it. Well, let's read about it. Matthew 13. Let's look at starting in verse 24 through 29. Somebody read that real quick.
Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them."
And verse 30.
Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn.
Okay, so there's that. So here is the kingdom of heaven is like, and then he tells the story, and so I think there's going to be I think if we kind of the takeaway here, if anybody has any other takeaways, please let us know. But my takeaway from this was in the kingdom of heaven, there's going to be a selection. Okay, meaning kind of to be a part of or to have access to, right? There's going to be a selection or a harvest or right at some point, and so how are we selected for the kingdom of heaven? Well, we're not kind of told here, but we're told throughout the rest of the Bible, okay? But there's going to be a selection. If you turn over to a parable that is read in Matthew 13, 47 through 50. Okay, the parable of the hidden treasure and the pearl. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Okay? So it's this treasure of treasures. it's worth more than anything else. It kind of belittles anything else, and kind of it's this great treasure that you think you know wealth, or you think you know treasure, or you think you know something, and then you stumble across this, and it just wipes away all that other stuff. And this is this treasure of treasures. Matthew 47 through 50. Sorry, I should have done this one first. The parable of the net. Okay, here this is another kind of the kingdom of heaven is like a net that caught the fish, and the fish are separated, right, once they come up. So this is back to the selection thing there. And then Matthew 13:31 through 33. The mustard seed, right? We've all remembered this one. And beginning with something very little that becomes very much, becomes very great. Okay? So these are some maybe characteristics of the kingdom of heaven. Something that becomes, taking something very little and having it become very much. There's a selection. It's a treasure of treasures. That's kind of what I thought about the kingdom of heaven. Any thoughts on that before I keep going, John?
Your example of the parable of the wheat and the tares in Matthew 13 is a great example of how both the weeds and the crop are allowed to prosper. And the selection occurs at the end.
Right. So the just and the unjust are blessed and prosper, and grow. Yeah, maybe. So the opposite of poor in spirit is we said maybe pride or personal independence. I'll do it myself. We are told in this paradox that in order to have greatness, to have the greatest treasure, the greatest reward, this kingdom of heaven, to be selected, to have this treasure of treasures, to have this maybe starting with something small that becomes this magnificent great thing, those who are poor in spirit will be blessed with that. Well, what does Jesus say about who is the greatest? Right? Well, we're talking about having this something that's the greatest treasure, being kind of, attaining this kind of, this great thing that maybe, started as something small. What does Jesus say about kind of how to become the greatest elsewhere in Scripture? Matthew 18, 1 through 4. What does that say? Oh, look at the heading here. The greatest in the kingdom of heaven. 18 verse 1. At that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a little child and had him stand among them. And he said, "I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." That sounds an awfully lot like Matthew 5. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the opposite of prideful and I can do it myself, doesn't it? Interesting how it all ties together. Any other thoughts on that? So you can read that same kind of commentary that Jesus said about the greatest and being humble and like a child in order to have access to the kingdom of heaven in Mark chapter 9, verses 33 through 35. Any other thoughts on poor in spirit, opposite of pride, and in order to kind of have, the kingdom of heaven, this treasure of treasures?
Well, it's like the song we sing, "Humble yourself before the Lord."
Mm-hmm. Yep. Being humble is not what the world would teach us, right? But is very important to God.
It says, "Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord."
Yep. Just as Jesus did, right? And he didn't, if anybody was going to be proud and puffed up, or had the right to be, yet he was kind of made himself the least of these, right? Howard?
I was going to suggest that I think it's telling us that we're receptive to the kingdom. We're not full of ourselves. We're open enough to realize that that's the truth that we have, and therefore the kingdom is that priceless gem that we'll go after. Whatever we have, we get rid of in order to grab that because we see that as being more valuable. So the reciprocity of this aspect is very important for us to perceive the value of the kingdom.
And that being able to do that often requires that we are the opposite of prideful or the opposite of this personal independence that society would teach us that is a valuable thing. Which, again, being able to be self-sufficient in things, I'm not saying, but again, the Bible teaches is very much kind of a humility, a very much a dependence on God, kind of, and those are very important things. Good comments. All right, let's go to the next one. Back to Matthew chapter 5. And all right, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Okay, mourning. What is the opposite of mourning? Rejoicing. Okay. Any other adjectives or words? Huh? Joyful, rejoicing, bliss, pleasure, cheerfulness, are all things would be kind of how we would describe the opposite of mourning. Okay, so the Bible teaches that in order to be comforted, you will be, those who are in mourning will receive that comfort as a blessing. Whereas the world would teach us that in order to receive comforts, we should seek after pleasures and these other things, and that's what's going to give you the comfort, right? And so that's the paradox. I don't think that we're being commanded or directed to be mourners here. And that God wants bad things to happen to us and our families and our friends so that we'll have an opportunity to mourn. I don't think that's what that's saying. Okay? This is something where God, God's going to notice his family members when they're in mourning, and he's going to take notice of you, and he is going to give you his comfort. Right? And that's the blessing. And what else do we read in Scripture about mourning? Is there anything maybe in the Old Testament or Ecclesiastes chapter 7 from King Solomon that we read about mourning? House of mourning. Let's turn over there real quick. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 2 through 4. If you can find that book. Who can find the book of Ecclesiastes the fastest in their Bible? Chapter 7, verses 2 through 4.
Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning.
But the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure.
Oh,
That's it. So basically says, better to go to a funeral than a party, is what King Solomon, kind of one of the wisest people, blessed with wisdom by God, is kind of telling us here. And I don't think that Scripture is teaching us to be these morbid kind of, living in kind of death's shadow and follow around funerals and all this kind of, and but I think, right, what could be good about going to a funeral as opposed to going to a party?
Generally times of reflection.
Okay. Reflection on what, though?
Lots of things. It could be the breadth of his life. It could be lessons learned from that individual's past.
Right.
It could be appreciating the time you've had with that individual.
Right, and those are all good things for us to kind of remember. It kind of puts our mortality in perspective. And whereas if we are at parties and all that, it's kind of like, here we go, and we got no worries, and I don't think that, and that's kind of all we do, and that's all we seek after, then you tend to forget these other things.
I think of mourning, it's a verse of you And a lot of times those that don't build relationships and really don't care about others don't really have anything more about.
So it puts our mortality in perspective, puts it emphasizes the importance of relationships, which is very important to God.
Well, I did a little bit of my homework last week, the assignment you gave us, and I read a commentary on this, and in the commentary that I read, it seemed as if this verse kind of built on the last verse. The last verse, blessed are the poor in spirit, and that's because they recognize the hopelessness of what our situation is, because our sin separates us from God. And there's nothing that we can do about that in and of ourselves. And so the second part of it, when it was talking about mourning, is it said that because you recognize so deeply what your situation is, that you mourn about that because it's a sin in your life and you're sorry for it. And so, I mean, you can mourn about anything. You mourn because I don't have as big a house as you have, maybe. But that's really not something that is worthy of it. We mourn because we know that our sin separates us from God. We know what our situation is.
All right, so puts our mortality in perspective, our relationships, a fallen state of man. All those are kind of put in perspective in situations where we are reflecting our kind of, in the house of mourning. All good things, as opposed to constantly seeking after personal pleasures, okay, to give us the comfort. And so, how does reflecting on our mortality, the fallen state of man, relationships with others, how does that, in times of mourning bring us comfort?
It shows us that we need God.
Yeah. So, being able to find kind of the right, as bad as this is, and woe is me in a kind of genuine kind of, it is, we're in a tough time, and being able to, I think, recognize and acknowledge kind of God and His comfort, and that is sufficient for me. And we think about Jesus and everything He went through at the end of His life, and with everything, and that was all He had, and it was a very, I mean, He was weeping blood and tears, but He had God with Him, and He recognized that, and He took that was His only comfort, in a very difficult situation, right at the end of His life.
When I think of someone during our lifetime on the national stage that most of us are familiar with is a former president, Jimmy Carter. He seemed like a humble man. He wasn't proud and puffed up, and he just, I know Arlene and I several years ago visited Plains, Georgia, passing through there, and we took the time to spend 3 or 4 hours touring his museum down there, in his former schoolhouse where he met his wife Rosamond, and they went to school together down there, and it's a museum there, and his house, we toured his house and his farm and everything. But he always presented to me that he was a humble man, but I just happen to think of him and how he presents himself then as president and now in life now.
So, but despite all of the kind of, analyzing that we're doing on this, I think that the main takeaway here, again, is back to the point that God notices His family or His children in their struggles and wants to and does provide comfort to them.
Yeah, Byron, the other thing that impresses me about this verse is the people gathered around Jesus at this time would have been the less affluent, the poor, the people who would have really felt the harshness of life. And they probably would have lamented about the state of the world, especially with Roman control all around them. And thinking back to when Solomon and King David, his throne, ruled, right? God over top of that. And here they are sitting at the feet of Jesus, who recognizes their mournful state and says, hey, fortunate are you that mourn, because you're going to be comforted. And the person who says it is the very person who's going to bring about that ultimate comfort.
Right.
So I think that's impressive too.
Well, good comments. All right, let's keep going here. We'll get it through a couple more before. And so next one, that's back to Matthew 5. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. All right, so what's the opposite of meek or meekness? Well, before we do that, what is meek? That's not a word that we hear too often these days. Maybe. But what does being meek mean?
Power under control.
Okay. Gentle. Okay.
Not timid.
So long-suffering, patient, gentle, maybe quiet sometimes even. Does it mean that, it doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to maybe exert power or control, but all it's talking about here is I think or all that we look at the word meek and it's this gentleness, long suffering, and that may be somebody who's very powerful, or it may be somebody who's not, but they have a patient gentleness about them. And it's particularly noticeable when we see it in people who are very powerful and they can have that meekness, which is rare, right? But people who are not powerful could probably have it too. So the opposite of that would be
Boastful.
Okay. Boastful, arrogant, aggressive, assertive, overbearing, impatient. Okay. So that would be kind of what the world maybe not impatient, but this kind of overbearing, this assertive. In order to get what you want, you got to assert yourself. You got to go after it. You got to be aggressive, right? You probably heard that if you're in business or different things, right? Where we got to, the early bird gets the worm and all this kind of stuff, which again, that's not bad to wake up early and to strive for things, but it's just another kind of cliche thing that we hear about the world and kind of the ambitions that the world teaches, right? Here we're learning the opposite of that. In order to gain, in order to get and to inherit the earth, to gain things here on this earth. We're told that those who are meek, those who are patient, those who are long-suffering, who are gentle, those are the ones who are going to be blessed with gains.
I think I would add to that, all of what was said, more of what Mark was suggesting, that this meekness is not necessarily between people as much as it is a meekness in relationship to God. That is, God is the eternal value here. And if we're meek and understanding that, then we accept God and we inherit the earth.
So similar to kind of the first beatitude about poor in spirit, maybe, right? The opposite of prideful. But I think, poor in spirit and meekness, or again, they're separate kind of points that are raised, right? So there's probably some sort of a difference that Jesus is getting at. But yeah, I would agree. If we turn over to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 38 through 42, later in the sermon that Jesus is giving, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. So, again, this is, not entirely at the issue of meekness, but I think we can see some undertones there in those comments of being, and even when we're being wronged, being gentle, being patient, being long-suffering, and that is the blessed virtue that God would have us do. That's the ways of God, which would be the opposite of the ways of men. And in those situations, the world would teach us to, you need to get what's yours, what's owed you. You need to get them back. You need to, go after it. You need to, all these sort of things, right? Which are not meek kind of responses. All right, we got a couple more here. Let's see. I was hoping I was going to get through all these today, but I'll do one more. Righteousness. All right, that's the next one. Oops, hold on. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Okay, so righteousness. What would be the opposite of righteousness? Okay.
Unrighteous.
Okay, unrighteous. Well, what does righteousness mean?
Right living. So
Doing what's right in the eyes of God, or right living, right? Or trying to do that, right? Or trying to live a righteous life. So if we're doing the opposite of that, so why would people do evil?
that's their nature.
Because what is that though? What's selfishness, right? This is what I want, and this is going to make me feel good or get revenge or whatever it is, right? But it's a selfish response, which is the opposite of righteousness. Okay, so this a looking to do for self rather than what is right or pleasing to God. Okay, and that's the paradox, the world versus what God teaches. So, and we're told here that in order to be filled, all right, we've all heard kind of the hole in the heart or the void, or, the God hole, or, these different things that we, but in order to be filled, those who seek righteousness will receive that fulfillment. As opposed to the world would say, you need, right, I want, I get, right? And that's what's going to fill, is what the world teaches. And so these desires for, pleasure or acknowledgement or control or wealth or power, right? These selfish desires is what the world teaches that's going to give you the fulfillment. Whereas here, the paradox or the teaching is that kind of, right, we seek after kind of trying to do what's right, seeking after God, living in the way that God originally designed and intended for his creation, humanity, to live. And living that way is going to be the best way we can live and be fulfilled in all the things that God originally intended and designed us to be before we kind of messed up and went astray. Right? All right. I think we're out of time, so we'll stop there. I will be out the next couple of weeks at the work on the weekend, but we'll have some subs, and I'll be back kind of probably at around 2 or 3 weeks from now. So thanks for being here. Hope this is beneficial to everyone. I know it sure is to me. The teacher always gets more out of it than the student, but